think, okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. I think you guys are really far away. I can barely see anybody. We don't bite. Why don't you guys move forward a little bit more and fill this gap? Yeah, there's sofa here. Please come and sit. Otherwise, we must shout very loudly. And then I might spit all over the camera. And Wei Yang will be very angry with me.
The other option is we move to the floor.
Yeah, or the other option is we can move to the floor as well. We don't mind. But yeah. Yeah, okay, great. Move forward. Yeah, I think we won't wait anymore. Thanks everyone for finding this place and making it here. I'm so amazed. I hope my instructions were good enough from exit C, walk through the hawker center, cross the road, up the stairs, up another stairs, turn left, and you're here. So thanks so much for coming and welcome to Wild Conversations. So what is Wild Conversations for those who have joined us for the very first time? It is a casual conversation that we usually have with an expert in the field about the environment, sustainability, biodiversity, wildlife, you have it. It's a very casual conversation, so please feel free to ask questions at any point in the time, raise your hands, go toilet, take a drink or something like that. So please feel free to do that. The other thing is I want to thank our venue partner, Strangers Conversations, who is, Tun Shien isn't here, he's left, but thank you so much to him for this beautiful space. We were previously at their other space at Geylang, and then now they've moved here. It is a place for community together, community of strangers like what we are today. So it's a nice space. Do check them out on Telegram, Instagram at Strangers Convos. So that is the venue. And of course, we would like to thank videographer and photographers, Wei Yang, Kelly, and San. So if you do not want your photos to be published, please let us know. Otherwise, you'll be on our Instagram. So please tag us at _wildspace as well. So while this is a free to attend conversation, we do want to also highlight our conservation partners in the industry, and we usually get our speaker to pick a conservation partner of choice, and they have chosen, actually Elliot's meant to come today, but he is actually running a fever, so he sends his apologies. But yes, they have chosen Rainforest Trust. So Rainforest Trust is a US-based NGO organization that creates rainforest reserves by establishing protected areas in partnership with local organizations and communities. And of course, if you'd like to contribute to keep us going, you can also make a small donation. I will pass this around. Just feel free to, just send it to our pay now. Okay. So I will start with a short introduction of our speakers. So today we have Tun Shien here with us. He is the Carbon Project Development Associate at Arkadiah Technology, and Arkadiah uses AI technology to transform the way carbon is harnessed beyond planetary restoration, beyond carbon removal. And he was also previously a carbon specialist at Climate Impact Act, CIX, a global marketplace and auctions house, and an exchange for carbon credits. So this is Tun Shien here with us. And what I like to do before I start is to see how much people know about this topic that we're talking about today. There are snacks as prizes, but even if you don't guess it correct, you still get a snack. But anyway, so okay, let's go. So how much CO2 does one carbon credit offset? Okay, it's a MCQ, yeah? A, 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide, CO2, 100 kilograms of CO2, and C, 1,000 kilograms of CO2. So how much CO2 does one carbon credit offset? A, 10. Raise your hands. No hands. B, 100. Okay, there are a few. C, 1,000. Oh, okay, majority. Yes, C is correct. So one carbon credit offsets 1,000 kilograms of CO2. Yeah? Okay. Next, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, how many countries has Singapore signed MOUs with the intention to collaborate on carbon markets? So this is very Singapore-based. Under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, if you don't know what that is, please go check it out later at google.com. How many countries has Singapore signed MOUs with the intention to collaborate on carbon markets? A, 16 countries. B, 36 countries, and C, 66 countries. A, 16 countries, raise your hands. Okay. B, 36 countries, raise your hands. Okay, that's half the room. C, 66 countries, raise your hands. One. Wow, okay. yeah. Actually, it's only 16 countries. No, it's not effective.
Soon.
Okay, soon. So this thing is the bilateral cooperative approach that will enable Singapore to achieve our emission targets set out in our NDC. So NDC is nationally determined contributions, while promoting sustainable development and environmental integrity. So because Singapore, we can't offset our own carbons, right? Because we don't have like a large forest patches and all that. So we have to work with other countries. So we have signed 16 MOUs with 16 countries. Yeah. Okay, the third question. Singapore has decided to contribute resources towards climate adaptation through bilateral cooperation. Right, so these MOUs are bilateral corporations. All projects under Singapore's implementation agreement will have to contribute how many percent, so X percent, of their share of proceeds or equivalent to the host country, so the country that we signed the MOU with, adaptation needs or their adaptation fund. So basically this percentage will go back to these host countries to help them with their adaptation needs and or their adaptation fund. Okay? So A, is it 2%? B, is it 5%? Or C, is it cent? Wow, no hands. Yeah, because we're not so stingy, right? B, 5%? Okay, half the room. C, 7%? Okay, 3 people. All right, so it is 5%. Yeah, so they have to contribute 5% back to the host country's adaptation needs. Yeah? Okay, so I think we've learned a little bit about our topic today. I'm not an expert myself, the expert sitting beside me, so we'll head to the expert to find out a little bit more. So maybe we'll start by getting you to explain a little bit more, maybe tell people about your job, your company and all that. Yeah?
Sure. Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm Tun. I don't think I'll call myself an expert, but I do know a little bit about carbon markets and happy to share. And I'm sure people in the room, you might have different pieces of knowledge about it as well. So happy to just hear your thoughts about it. Just tell you guys a bit more about myself and the work that I'm currently doing with Arkadiah. So Arkadiah is actually my second job within the carbon markets itself. I've been in the carbon markets for slightly over 3 years, moving from NGO to Climate Impact X, which is a marketplace where we buy and sell carbon credits. And then now at Arkadiah, I'm with the project development team developing nature-based projects on the ground within Southeast Asia. So a bit more about the company. The description can have a bit of technical jargon, but maybe just to simplify it, we are a nature tech company that uses remote sensing and satellite data to map out forests and be able to estimate the amount of carbon that stays within the forest and the amount that gets sequestered as trees grow over time. So I would say there's 2 main tracks of work. One would be on the geospatial side, so the ones that will work with the satellite tech, remote sensing to measure the carbon, and then the carbon project development side, which is the team that I'm in to work with stakeholders on the ground to implement projects with the communities.
Okay. Before I go on to my questions, does anyone else have questions? Okay, maybe we start with something simple.
Okay.
So can you explain what a carbon credit is? We must explain what the basis of this is.
I think carbon credits actually have been in the space for quite some time. But I guess explaining carbon credits, I'll talk a bit about how it was started and then what is currently being used for. So carbon credits is in a way for organizations to offset their emissions. So what that means is that if I am an industry that emits a lot of emissions, most of the time energy extractive kind of industries, and let's say definitely comes from the forestry sector where they are actively protecting forests or doing reforestation works, planting forests, they are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm a heavy emitter and I can purchase carbon credits from someone who does and manages the projects to minus off my own emissions. So if I'm +1, I'm -1, and essentially I get a 0. So this whole talk about carbon neutrality, net zero, a lot of organizations, while they are also doing their effort to reduce their own emissions, a lot of times, it's either difficult to hit, or sometimes the technologies are too expensive or not as developed yet. So in the short term, they will purchase carbon credits to offset these emissions. As Stephanie mentioned, each carbon credit is 1,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, or how we usually say it is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And the carbon credits can range in prices depending on the type of projects that they come from too.
So in terms of when you say range in prices, can you give us an example of like how much is it? Like maybe an average pricing of one carbon credit? Would you have like a price, a market price for that?
So actually average pricing, I've seen carbon credits be priced from $2 to 1,000. So that big of a range, it really depends on the kind of projects that you develop. So if you look at renewable energy, very easily deployed, a little bit controversial, I would say. Those usually get sold at a cheaper rate just because it's so easy to implement. The $1,000 are these huge carbon capture machines that you see in Norway that actively, where they have to build that machine to take in carbon dioxide from the environment and sequester it geologically. That process is very expensive, takes a lot of time. Sometimes the technology is not as well developed yet. And that's why the carbon credits that are developed from these projects are super expensive. So yeah, the most I've seen is about $1,000.
Okay. So of course they range from 2 to 1,000. So what would stop for me, I would choose to buy the $2 one because then I can quickly offset my carbon emissions, right? So what would make someone purchase like $1,000 credit versus like a $2 credit? Yeah.
So, well, the $2 and $1,000 credit, it really falls down to what the organization wants out of purchasing the credit. Because essentially, one carbon credit is 1 ton. That doesn't change regardless of where it's generated from. But what do you support with the money is, if you purchase from the renewable energy project, essentially that proceeds will go back to the project. So nature-based projects, if you were to purchase credits from there, the finance from that would naturally funnel back to the development of that project, sustaining the communities on the ground, protecting the biodiversity. In that aspect, I think that's where people then decide what kind of credits they want to purchase and what projects they want to support.
Okay. So you would call, so your company, Arkadiah, does nature-based projects, right?
Yes.
So maybe you can kind of explain what nature-based projects are versus like maybe, I guess, renewable projects versus nature-based projects versus, I guess, the other one that you just mentioned, the big machine that sequesters a lot of carbon into like a geothermal space. Yes.
So I would, I guess, introduce like 2 different carbon markets first. One is the compliance side. So that's government regulated, it's a top-down hammer system where you say, okay, you can only emit so much. Anything more, you got to pay extra. You got to buy offsets to offset that. So that's on the compliance side. Where we are working in is the voluntary space. So as the name goes, it's voluntary. If I decide to purchase it, I can then offset my emissions. How we usually classify carbon credits is, there are 2 main ways of doing it. One would be nature-based versus tech or engineered solutions. So nature-based is your forest conservation, restoration, tree planting, agroforestry, anything that has to do with nature as the conduit to sequester and lock in carbon. The other side of credits, engineer and tech-based will be your direct air capture, those huge machines, anything that's more techy, I would say. So renewables will naturally fall under that engineered solution space as well. The second way that we use to classify carbon credits would be either avoidance or removal. So avoidance would be the concept of forest protection. So you prevent a plot of forest from being deforested. In that aspect, you prevent the emissions trapped in the forest to be emitted. So avoid it. The other side would be removals, where you involve activities like tree planting. So as the trees grow, they take in carbon dioxide from the environment, removing it further from the system.
I see. Interesting. Okay. Any questions so far from the floor? Yeah.
So it's renewable energy under avoidance.
Yes.
Oh, it's renewable energy under avoidance. Sorry, you have to repeat for the people online.
Okay.
Yeah. But yes,
Got it.
so yeah, is renewable energy considered an avoidant method? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And how is the price of the carbon credit determined then? Is it determined by the market or the project developer?
So how is the value of this carbon credit? How do you value this product, right? So who determines the value?
Yeah. I guess before I answer the question, I know in the whole carbon credit space, there can be quite a bit of technical jargon. Apologies first if I accidentally blurt out something without explaining. But if there's any term that I mentioned that maybe it's the first time hearing it or want me to explain a little bit further, just do pause and I can explain. Maybe to answer the question on how carbon credits get priced. So every developer, when they start out planning their projects, they would have to do a balance sheet. As per any organization, when they run a company, they have to make sure that the financials work. So as part of the financials, they will factor in a price of their carbon credits. So naturally, they would intend for that price to increase. So usually what the credits are being sold at the start is based on your initial financial planning. But once it goes out into the market, getting traded on marketplaces, platforms, exchanges like Climate Impact X, where I used to work, then it's a function of demand and supply. So how much supply there is in the market, how much versus how much demand of credits there are in the market. So the standard, I guess, like economics, where if there's low supply, high demand, the price naturally will go up. Yeah.
So just following up to that question, so don't you think that currently there are more emissions, so obviously there's more demand from the market than there can be supplies because considering we're using fossil fuels every day and these companies have been around for ages, so don't you think that the current demand is just so much infinitely more than the supply can actually catch up with? Yeah.
I think if you look at overall emissions as the demand, yes, naturally, like the supply, you definitely need to scale up the supply. I think that's why a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are pushing for these projects. Of course, these projects must be done properly, which we can talk a little bit more later. But the demand would also be a result of whether companies are willing to purchase and whether they want to purchase. So even if companies, some of the names that openly declare, they report that they purchase carbon credits, your Microsoft, your Amazon, your Google, they might be a little bit more selective on what they buy. They have specific requirements, so because of that, the demand also differs depending on credits.
Can you give us an example of like how they would evaluate what they want to purchase? From a buyer's perspective.
Yeah. So in terms of carbon credits, I think what most companies will start with is the foundational stuff, whether the accounting side of the carbon credits is accurate. So I will call that like carbon foundation. So whether 1 ton is actually a ton, whether they're overestimating, underestimating, whether they are using technology to measure versus going down to the field to wrap a tape around a tree and measure how much it grows over time. The next thing that a company will look at is the additional benefits that come together with the credit. So let's say it's a nature-based project, whether the money, if after buying the credits, any revenue that the company obtains, how much of it is channeled back to the community? How much work are they doing in monitoring biodiversity within that plot of forest? Are they planting a monoculture plantation, eucalyptus and teak, just to be chopped down 13 years later for timber? Or are they considering native species on the ground, a variety of species, trying to connect fragmented ecosystems? So those are the things that some of these companies will look into. And these are some of the factors that would influence the price as well, because the more benefits that the project brings, usually it leads to a higher price in the credits.
So would you say that, so for example, if a project is planting trees that maintain, like for example, like you mentioned, they don't get chopped down 13 years later for production. So those kind of projects will naturally cost more because they add value to the ecosystem. they bring benefits, and then it also benefits obviously the community. So those kind of projects are valued a lot more. But this value, are you saying, is determined by the buyer? So only if the buyer sees this value in this project, instead of just wanting to offset their carbon emissions, then technically the value is still determined by the buyer at the end of the day.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions so far from the audience? Yeah.
How is it verifying the long term, right? Because the buying and selling is happening initially, but how do you know that credit is going to be verified long term?
So how do you verify the project's long term? Because I guess that's a really good question, right? You know, you can start a project today, 13 years later, maybe this person who verified the project is not in the company anymore. So yeah, how do you ensure that?
So in terms of credits, I think, well, verifying, I would look at it on two fronts. So one, making sure that if I buy this amount of credits, that same amount of credits meaning I put it against my own emissions, those credits can't be used for another company's emissions. So in terms of that accounting wise, globally, there are a couple of, we call them registries. They are the ones that certify these projects, issue the credits, and they have their own balance book. So if once the credits are retired, they are reflected on that account where anybody is publicly available and nobody can then purchase that credit anymore. So that on that end, that's how it gets verified and accounted for in the long term. Looking at the project side, how it ensures that the project stays viable in the long run, that has always been a tougher question, because it's, when it comes down to tech-based projects or renewable energy projects, there's not a lot of human involvement within these projects. You know, you let the machines run, they will do their job, that's about it. But when it comes down to nature-based projects, when you want additional benefits to biodiversity, additional benefits to landscapes, most of the time it involves local communities as well. And a lot of these forest projects would involve indigenous peoples too. But as any project, not only carbon or any organization out there, once there's the human element involved, it gets a little bit more complicated. So to ensure that the project stays active for long term and making sure that, you know, whatever forest that you're protecting doesn't get chopped down, that the trees that are grown doesn't get chopped down, you need to ensure that these communities involved get the benefits too. So it's not just the project developer involved, they have to benefit from the project. And how it's being monitored, of course, there will always be improvements in tech. So with tech, a lot of times it's real-time monitoring, where you can just deploy a satellite over and then see whether that particular plot of trees is being chopped down, what's been growing year on year. In a way, you know, you don't need to be physically on the ground every day to know that the project is still standing, but there's a way for you to verify that data.
Okay, so you know, you said use tech, and then I know your company is using AI technology for this purpose. Could you maybe kind of explain what your company does, so a little bit more into the tech component of it?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the traditional way of forest monitoring, if you remove the technology, you know, you got to look for huge trees, you got to wrap a tape around, and then measure what they call the diameter at breast height, looking at, you know, the tree growth over time, and then you kind of calculate the amount of carbon that's stored within that tree. You then extrapolate it over a large amount of area, then you account for the carbon sequestered and carbon avoided within that plot of forest. That in itself is highly time consuming because there's only so many trees you can measure a day. It's resource intensive because everybody needs to be trained to that level to measure it accurately. And because of that, it's highly expensive to deploy that at scale. So workaround is using technology to monitor it remotely. So what they like to call remote sensing using LiDAR. So what we do as a company is that we have that tech available, either using satellites to look at land cover, making sure that forest stays a forest, or deploying technology, drones and aircrafts above to measure the amount of carbon that's captured within the forest. There's a lot more technicalities that go behind the process. Happy to talk about it as well if there's any interest. But I think, yeah, I'll just keep it at that for now.
Any interest? Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Sure. I would put a caveat that, I'm working on explaining it myself. So, in case it doesn't get a little bit, in case there's, you want it to be a little bit more clearer, do sound it off, because I'm wrapping my head around it too. So, what it works is that as you fly an aircraft over, if anybody in the room has a better way to explain it or knows the space better than me, please feel free to speak out. Again, it's always a collective, effort of knowledge. So, yeah, just before I start, anybody kind of knows how it works and don't mind explaining it too.
I did a little bit of research for a science project.
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
It was mostly monitoring how.
I'll pass you my mic so that the people online can hear. Yeah. Can just
It was mostly researching how like drones and satellites can monitor biodiversity. So how they can like go without intruding on the like forests and stuff, and it can like monitor like how animals move around, and therefore how we can be more informed on how to protect the, like, for example, like monitoring migration paths and observing animal behavior patterns to more learn how to protect animals from extinction. And yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, actually that is a very integral part of the work that we're doing and the work that we are currently exploring as well. So the whole biodiversity piece, it's how to be able to monitor biodiversity while you're not physically in the forest. So one of the most classic ways is camera traps, where you deploy that at scale, you can see biodiversity moving within that plot that you're monitoring. But another way that is being explored is bioacoustics. So every animal has a very distinct sound, I would say. Like humans, you can recognize speech. So that, in essence, is able to pinpoint the species and where they are being captured from. So, birds have their own calls, you can identify that. And an interesting thing that I've heard of is that they're using bioacoustics to monitor illegal deforestation. So if they deploy a sensor and you can hear a super loud chainsaw, you know that there's something going on there. And the rangers will get deployed to make sure that no illegal work happens within that forest plot. So that's one. The stuff that we are doing is similarly using drones and satellites to monitor remotely. What we do is we take an aerial image of the forest plot and then track the distance between the drone and the forest itself. And every monitoring cycle, every year, every 2 years, as that distance decreases, you kind of know how much the tree is growing, and use scientific equations that have been generated by researchers over years of research to calculate the amount of carbon that's being stored in that forest. So essentially, that's how we utilize technology to monitor forest carbon remotely.
Yeah, thanks.
I hope that is clear, but this is the first few times that I'm using and explaining that.
Yeah.
So if there's any further clarification, please do just voice out too.
There's this, so you spoke about the phones. So there's this company, it's San Francisco based, it's called Rainforest Connections. So they take old cell phones and they mount it on it looks a little bit like a flower, but not really, but it's a flower of old handphones. And then of course they have solar panels, and then they put it all the way up onto really tall trees in the rainforest, and then it captures the sound essentially, because capturing sound doesn't take so much energy doesn't drain your battery, whereas videos do. Yeah, so then the solar is able to power the phone. It's an old phone. It's a lot of old phones. Yeah. So it's a really cool technology. So you guys should check it out. Rainforest Connections. Okay. So maybe just going back to kind of how do you develop projects? I think we spoke about how these carbon credits come about and then you go and measure them. But how do we, say for example, if I'm keen to develop a carbon-based project so that I can offset my carbon credits, I believe some of the large organizations, they do, right? Because, for example, like Shell or Exxon, they have to offset a lot of carbon, and they might not be able to buy that much from the market, so they might have to generate their own offsets. So how do you, as a person in this nature-based carbon project team, develop a project like that? And yeah, maybe you could kind of explain that. Yeah.
So in developing a carbon project where you want to generate carbon credits to sell, I think there's a lot more technicalities involved into considering whether the land is suitable, whether there's a need to develop carbon projects. But I think for a company that would be interested in offsetting their own emissions, not necessarily through the whole purchasing of carbon credits, they can get involved by working with NGOs on the ground, supporting the work to either protect forests or do reforestation works, not necessarily to generate carbon credits, but because of the investment from these larger corporate organizations, they can count their emissions avoided or removed towards their own balance books. But in the aspect of carbon projects, as I mentioned, the technicalities behind it are a little bit more complex. So you have to make sure that the land is suitable for carbon projects. Every single project has to be verified using a methodology. So there's a method of accounting the amount of carbon that's being stored, amount of carbon that's being removed over time. And these methods are created by these global registries. The account holders where, when I mentioned earlier, the ones that are tracking who purchased the credits, who retired the credits. These registries create their own methods as well. And interested organizations like Arkadiah, who's developing projects, they will then adopt and use these methodologies against the projects that they are developing. So a method for forest protection will be very different from another project that is looking at reforestation. Again, very different from a renewables project, very different from a direct air capture project. So different methods for different project types, and then they have to look into that and make sure that whatever project that they design aligns with that particular method.
Can you share with us which are some of the registries that are around and that maybe they can go look up after the conversation? Yeah.
So two of the biggest registries in the voluntary space will be Verra, so that's VERRA, and the second one would be Gold Standard. So these are the two that make up most of the market in the voluntary carbon space. Verra, is focused more on the nature-based side. A lot of projects are developed under Verra. Not that Gold Standard doesn't, but they do have a larger proportion of credits and projects from that community-based energy efficiency and waste management space.
So does that mean that every firm that develops a project has to go through either Verra or Gold Standard to get their projects certified, you would say? Okay, so there are only two companies in the voluntary space you mentioned. So there is a voluntary and a non-voluntary accrediting agency. Is that right?
So for the voluntary space, Verra and Gold Standard are the two biggest, but there are many other smaller standards out there that are also gaining traction. But I think these are the two that are most internationally used and recognized. There are some that are more tailored to specific regions. So there's one known as the American Carbon Registry. As the name goes, all the projects are within the Americas. And there are other standards that are more domestic as well. So there's one based in France that's meant for projects that are within France itself. If we go back a bit to the two different markets, so that's on the voluntary side. On the compliance side, it really comes down to individual domestic markets. So if Singapore has our own compliance scheme, they would set the standard on what should be used, how they should account for carbon, and then every company that falls under the compliance side will have to follow suit.
So is the compliance agency then, I guess, a government organization? Then it's not considered like a third party, right? Because if they were to be the ones setting the standards of how companies should offset their carbon, then it should be, I guess, a national standard, right? So you're saying that there is an agency in Singapore that does that?
So compliance, what I understand is that most of the time governments will set the rules around what they can do for their offsets. whether it's, Singapore has a carbon tax that, is set to increase. That's one way to do it. Another way would be, the EU has an emissions trading scheme where they can trade across countries, cross borders, and the rules can also include the use of voluntary credits. So actually what Singapore has done with the updates to its carbon tax as of this year is that the total taxed amount for the carbon tax, a maximum of 5% can be offset by the use of internationally recognized carbon credits. So even within the compliance scheme, because the compliance scheme is set by regulators, they can then set the rules of, okay, should I introduce voluntary carbon credits into the space? And if I would like to, how much can I introduce? So they would set a limit on that as well.
Are there more people who are voluntarily in the market space, do you think? Because I think for compliance, I guess we don't really need to talk about it because they won't be able to operate if they don't offset their carbon emissions. But how about in the voluntary space? Do you see a lot of players coming into the market to voluntarily do this? Yeah.
More and more. I would say that a couple of years ago, there was a wave of people interested in purchasing carbon credits. But as I mentioned at the start, carbon credits can be a little bit controversial as well. There are a lot of things that can be improved in the space. How projects are being monitored can be done more accurately, and making sure that the projects don't impede on the livelihoods of local communities. I think a lot of the watchdogs have now moved away from looking at your carbon foundation to whether people's human rights are being treated properly. Making sure that any communities that are involved in the projects are not exploited, because again, that's not the whole intent of the project.
Could you give us an example of something like that has happened before, where, like, in what way were they exploited, and how can we, maybe if we head out to like a village or something and then we notice things like that happening, like do you have examples? Just wondering.
So there are a couple of projects that have been flagged. So a couple some in Africa, some in Latin America, closer to home, some in Cambodia. So most of it comes down to really on the human rights angle, whether they, before a project starts, most of the time what project developers have to do is they will call free, prior, and informed consent. So essentially what that entails is that you have to talk to every member of the community that's within the area that you want to do your project, and make sure that they are aware that this is happening, make sure that they are educated on what the project is about, make sure that they're okay with it, and if they have any comments, you have to consider it as well. So you can't be going ahead saying, okay, I'm going to protect X amount of forest. Anybody who's staying in that forest, please move your homes outside. No such thing. You're not supposed to do that. That would be a super big red flag. So it's how you work with communities within the area to implement the project. So how these projects then get flagged is that certain things might have slipped through the gaps. Abuses of human rights, that's clearly one. Not getting the benefits that they were promised, that's another. Most of the time, it really comes down to money. Whether they receive monthly payouts as they were supposed to, as they are promised at the start, whether infrastructure has been built as they were promised, prior to the project, and whether people have been treated fairly.
So Vera and Gold Standard, being the certification bodies, would then have to go down to actually audit these projects that say that they are contributing these benefits to these people and it gives back. So they would have to do that. Is that right?
It's not only Vera. So within the whole carbon credit space, every project would have to work with a third-party validator or verifier. So someone who's not Vera and who's not the project developer. So essentially a neutral party. They are the ones that are the experts in assessing these projects. So they'll go in with a neutral eye, look at the documents, track that everything is accurate. They will go down to the site, make sure that everything is accurate, talk to the community members as well, interview them and making sure that the concerns are being considered. And then after that is done, do their own reporting and submit it over to the certifying bodies like Vera. Vera then does a second layer of check on these documents alongside the documents that a project developer does before allowing the project to run and start generating carbon credits.
Okay, so you would say that's pretty robust in terms of the number of layers of, I guess, audit that the project has to go through. So you guys are considered the first level, right? The developers of the project, and then you have the auditors and then the certification bodies before the carbon credit goes out to the market for sale.
Yes.
Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Yes.
Are we talking mostly about terrestrial carbon projects? Other, I mean, I know that generally it's more terrestrial based because it's easier to calculate, but are there like an increasing number of marine or freshwater carbon sequestering projects?
So I think the question is whether there are more than just terrestrial-based projects, because terrestrial forms a very large part of what we know of today. Yes.
I think terrestrial, it started with terrestrial, you're right, because purely on an accounting basis, it's easier to account for carbon in a standing forest, where as it's just generally more accessible. Somebody can walk into the forest, account for the carbon within that plot. For the marine side, or what people usually term as blue carbon, that's gaining a lot of traction. So a lot of people are actually keen in developing projects or purchasing credits from these blue carbon projects, the likes of mangrove, seagrass, salt marshes. But the carbon accounting is still, I would say, less robust as the terrestrial side, less developed, only because it's a lot more difficult to account for carbon that's stored within below ground. So anything in the roots and soil. So that part takes a little bit more effort. And as any carbon credit goes, you need to make sure that the accounting is robust prior to issuing any carbon credits, because you wouldn't want a case where you account for it using something that's less accurate. You issue the carbon credits, and then a couple of years down the road, you get flagged saying that actually you shouldn't have accounted it that way, or you should have used a more up-to-date method.
Has that happened before?
It has actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that means you purchase this X amount of credits, and then 5 years later, someone tells you, sorry, you cannot. Really?
Not cannot,
That's terrible.
but I think further down the road, you start to realize maybe the accounting methods that are being used is not the most robust, or there has been overestimation of credits being generated. Yeah.
How would you solve that issue?
So how do you solve if someone flags that out like many years later?
So a safety net that all the different registries like Vera and Gold Standard have is the concept of a buffer pool. So let's say you are able to issue 100 carbon credits. Every project will then have to put X amount of credits into this buffer pool. So let's say 20%. So if you can issue 100, you put 20%, so 20 credits into the buffer pool, and that means you can only sell 80 credits. And that buffer pool acts like a form of insurance. If anything were to happen within that forest plot, a couple of years down the road, that plot of forest, accidentally set on fire, the trees disappear from the forest plot. They would then take additional credits from the buffer pool and cancel it out as that insurance policy, in short. Yeah.
Okay, so that is interesting.
What would you mean by cancel it out?
So the credits in the buffer pool are actually still recognized credits, just that it cannot be sold. But once they cancel it out, it means that they wouldn't, essentially in the balance book for the projects, they would have issued fewer credits per se. Yeah.
But for companies that bought the credits, then what happened?
So for companies that bought the credits, there are cases that it goes a little bit overboard, where the buffer pool is not sufficient to account for the amount of total loss. In that case, it gets a little bit trickier. So by rights, once a company has offset their emissions, purchased the credits and retired it, they would have counted as retired. So there's no look back kind of procedure for that.
So you can't bring it back to the market again.
So a lot of that controversy and discussion falls around that. What happens to me if I purchase a credit that accounted for emissions a few years ago, and then some new information just came to light? Is there any insurance policy around it? How do I make sure that the project is being run properly? I think it comes down to the amount of due diligence that companies have on these projects as well. Prior to some of these issues being raised, a lot of them would take it at surface level, do their own due diligence, of course, but they might not be aware or have the knowledge to look into these areas. But now that these things come to light, when companies assess projects and purchase credits, the amount of checks that they go through is a lot more extensive. So sometimes even requesting developers to say, hey, bring me down to the site. I want to see it for myself. Nothing beats the person purchasing the credits going down to the field and seeing the project in action, talking to the people there. Yeah.
Does that often happen? Like people going down the field to check the real project is actually happening, so they're not obviously not selling something that's non-existent. Yeah.
From time to time. So it depends on how involved the companies want to get. A lot of times the ones that are investing in these projects would include that process as part of their due diligence.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I want to know your thoughts about, so for example, when we take a plane nowadays, we as consumers, they offer you to offset your carbon emissions. What are your thoughts about that? Tough question.
So I'm going to reply as an individual.
Sure.
So I'm not wearing my work hat anymore. So when it comes down to offsetting your own personal emissions, to me, after being in the space, it really depends on the level of transparency that you get. Because a lot of times it's, sure, companies that are offering offsets, at the foundational level, it's always for a greater good, but where the money then goes to, sometimes they are not
For
shared.
offsetting, is it?
Yeah, shared openly. So the best case scenario is you purchase directly from the project developer, the ones that are developing the projects, and making sure that there are as little middlemen as possible before you reach the community where your $1, $2, or $10 is supposed to go to. But because of confidentiality around it, a lot of times you don't really know. So personally, prior to knowing that, I have purchased offsets before, and I still do. But the places where I go to purchase the offsets and the considerations that I have will differ.
So what are some of the things that we as consumers can look out for when we are looking to offset our carbon purchases, of course? And then the other question is, then can we purchase from developers directly, because will developers sell to an individual? Yeah.
So a lot of times developers wouldn't engage with individuals because it's very difficult to track. Most of their time is spent managing the projects. So they wouldn't want to divert their attention to engaging the community and purchase. Not engaging the community, but selling it to the mass market where individuals can purchase. They will focus their energy on engaging larger corporates where they can purchase larger amounts of credits at a go. That's more use of their time and energy. In terms of the things that I look at, I usually look at the amount of benefits that the project brings, and of course the overall general sentiment around the project as well. There are a few projects out there that are highly regarded, the ones that have been doing the job well for over 10 years or more already, and also looking at new ones that are coming on board, who the project developer is, whether they have a credible track record, if there are any criticisms around it as well, how they address it. So those are the things that I look at. I would say it's definitely tougher for individuals to know completely about the project. I can say that I know slightly more only because I work in the space, but for everyone else, it's very extensive due diligence. So there's also a certain level of trust that you have to place into, the areas that the Shopee and Lazada equivalent, of the places that you go and purchase carbon offsets from.
Is there a particular regulation that says that if they're selling, obviously like airline companies, when you put it out there for sale, right? Is there a regulation that states that they need to kind of say what project it supports, or they can just say, I'm just selling one carbon credit? Do they have to report?
They do.
They do.
Yeah, so you can't be, if I understand the question correctly, it's if whoever the entity is selling the carbon credit, they can't just be selling, hi, I'm selling carbon credits, please, kind of like a lemonade stand.
Yeah.
They have to show like a signboard of like photos and where the project is from. Yeah, they do.
Oh, okay, okay. So if, for example, we go onto like SIA's website, we can see what projects they support.
Yes. you
Okay,
can.
so we should all go to SIA's website and see. Yeah. Any questions from the floor? Yeah.
Like, so you mentioned that there are a few carbon project developers. So since it's kind of like a market, do these people or these project developers get competitive? And then in the process of making their project more competitive, do they actually harm the environment rather than benefit the environment?
So is competition good? I think that's the real question. Yeah.
I've come to view competition as, I mean, you can see it as both good and bad. Competition would encourage different people to adopt new practices and sometimes better practices. But where competition gets a little bit difficult is when they are trying to maximize profits from these projects. So a lot of times is when it comes down to transparency, how much they're willing to disclose and whether they know and have the skill set to engage the project and the community as well. It's all about setting the foundation right. Where I've seen competition go a little bit to the negative side is when they try to rush some of these projects. Because as much as we're on a time crunch to do as much as we can, to create as much action as we can for the environment, you have to understand that when working with some of these nature-based projects, it takes a longer time. It's not as easy as building a structure and removing carbon or preventing carbon emissions. When you work with people, it's about understanding, gaining their trust, making sure that your intention is genuine. You're not there to scam them in the long run. And that trust itself takes super long to build, but very easy to break. So in the essence, you have to really go in with the real purpose of benefiting whoever you are supporting. Yeah.
How long, when you say it takes a long time, how long is long usually?
So for most of the nature-based projects, I would say it ranges from 1.5, 2 years to 5, 6 years until before they can start generating carbon credits. It really depends on the type of project as well. It's easier to generate credits from a forest protection project only because the forests are already standing. You're just preventing it from being cut down. Compared to another project where it's completely barren land where you are planting trees from the ground up. Trees take time to grow, and there's no way we can wish for that to get faster as much as we would love to. We have to make sure that we are patient enough to let things run its course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Can you give a number to how many carbon credits are per project? So can you give a range? Give us a real world example of just I'm working on a project that is going to be 5 carbon credits, or it's going to be 50,000 or 1 million, or how much are we talking?
Yeah.
So can we find out? Can you give us a more absolute number so that we can find out this forest plot can generate how much carbon credits? Yeah.
So you talked about that they close, that at some point they get retired. Was the word used? So that they can't do any more. So they must be finite. So what's the range?
Actually, the concept of retirement is not exactly when they can't generate any more credits. Retirement would be minusing off that credit against my own emissions. So once I've factored it against my own emissions, that carbon credit can no longer be used for other emissions, and that's the concept of retirement. In terms of an absolute number of how many credits can be generated from each project, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head because it really varies across projects, but the numbers are disclosed on the registry accounts as well. So if you go to the registry, you look for specific projects, you actually can know how big the project is and an estimate of how many credits can the project issue year on year. But maybe just comparing the scale, most of the time forest protection projects generate a lot more credits than reforestation just because the areas are a lot bigger, and also because natural standing trees can sequester carbon a lot more than saplings that you're trying to plant. blue carbon projects, the likes of mangroves, would sequester more carbon as well, just because of the profile of the ecosystem. So it really comes down to what kind of environment you're trying to protect and restore versus what activity you're trying to do, whether it's to protect or whether it's to restore or to sustainably manage whatever is already there.
Would you say that the projects are exclusive? So for example, would you just say, okay, we are just doing reforestation, or we are just doing protection, or we are just doing community, protecting community livelihoods? Or are they usually a mixture, a bag of things? Yeah.
I've seen projects across both types. I would say in my own experience, a lot more projects tend to stick with one type. So they just solely focus on protection, solely focus on restoration or management. But now I think there's a lot more focus on multi-type, just because as nature goes, it's very hard to say, I'm just protecting this part, I'm going to carve out my project just nicely so that that part, if it's degraded, it's not my area. It's difficult to do that because you can't really control nature in that aspect. So when it comes down to land itself, it's really considering where you are looking to start your carbon project and what kind of activities you can do, and whether you have the ability to put in different activities too. So both protection and restoration.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions from the floor? Yep.
What happens to the communities there when something bad happens to the project, like forest fires and stuff?
So yeah, what happens to the communities that are affected by a project that goes like downhill? Yeah.
So you mentioned a pretty good term actually, safeguards. So safeguards is one of the biggest things that are being considered right now, making sure that both environmental and social safeguards are considered for projects. So what that entails is that as part of the process of developing the project, you have to do a risk assessment too. As per any activity that we organize out there, you have to look at natural risks, human-induced risks as well, and the likelihood of that risk. So if it's a high likelihood or low likelihood, you have to put in mitigation measures just to make sure that you know how to control or reduce the likelihood of the risk. So in the case of a forest fire, measures can be put in place beforehand to make sure that it's properly managed. And if there is the concept of controlled burning, which a lot of indigenous people still practice, where they clear land in a controlled manner to prevent the spread of larger forest fires, be controlled and managed as well. So in a way that's aligned with whatever they practice, but you don't induce and create more risk than necessary.
But if something that already happens, then how are they being protected? Since they do, to a certain extent, rely on the revenue from these credits for livelihood.
Yeah. So when it comes down to that, most of the projects would then have a safeguard mechanism in place to make sure that they still get protected while all these, in the event of a natural disaster happening that can't be predicted or controlled.
Is there like insurance for them? Like how we have our own insurance for medical and stuff like that?
So carbon insurance is something that's fairly new, only because there are so many more factors to consider. When you're insuring, I don't think for carbon insurance. Well, to my knowledge, I don't think you insure the individuals, but you insure the project as a whole. But how that trickles down to the communities, that is something else that I think I'm not in the best position to explain. But yeah, it's new and still being explored, the concept of insurance.
Yeah, that's good to know that it exists. I think then it protects a wider community that might need it. Yeah. Okay. I just want to be mindful of time because, in fact, we do have a film that I want to share today with you guys. I think we've been talking so much about nature and how we are, I guess, exploiting it on the markets for our own benefit. So the film is actually called "Does Nature Have Rights?" So it is a 27-minute film. So just sit back and relax and enjoy the show. Let me try and get it up and running right now.
I will move to the back so everybody has a front row seat. Sorry.
Okay, so here we go. I hope you can hear.